Last spring, as we watched the explosion of all the things going on, both Arab Spring and WikiLeaks and all these things that were going on, we started to have conversations here at the school about how to present these issues in our public affairs programming and how to think about them. And at the time, we sort of thought, well, we're going to look at the underlying policy issues, be it WikiLeaks or revolutions or whatnot. But we started to have this conversation, and really it was with Hugh Price, who unfortunately is not here today, about whether we should be looking at the media that was fueling a lot of these underlying revolutions in communications and policy. And exactly at that time that we were having those conversations, this amazing article came out in The Atlantic by James Fallows. And we read it and we said, oh, well, our work's done. He framed the issue perfectly, and so here's our series. And it helped us think through how we wanted to present this. And so then we thought, well, if we could get James Fallows here to actually talk about it and launch the series, it would be really terrific. And so we are absolutely thrilled that you are here today. If you haven't read the article, the title is Learning to Love the Shallow, this is in quotes, or in parentheses, shallow, divisive, unreliable new media. And so, again, it is really a brilliant piece. If you haven't read it, I suggest that you do, but I think we will hear a good snapshot of it today. To give you a little background on James Fallows, he's a national correspondent for The Atlantic, where he's worked for nearly 30 years, based in cities around the globe. In addition to working for The Atlantic, he spent 2 years as chief White House speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, 2 years as the editor of U.S. News and World Report, and 6 months as a program designer at Microsoft, which I found very interesting. I always like learning about the bios of the people you think you know about. He's also now the chair in U.S. media at the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney in Australia, and has won all sorts of awards, both for his print work as well as some of his documentary work, including something I just learned about, the New York Emmy, which is an award given for documentary. And probably most impressive to me, he's an instrument-rated private pilot, and had the weather been better today, he would have flown himself to Princeton, but Amtrak had to bail him out. So please help me welcome James Fallows.
Thank you very much, Professor Donahue, for your gracious introduction. Thank you all for having me here. I'll say something about the travel mode. I think I caused a real mental breakdown or friction in the planning department of for the Woodrow Wilson School, because they were saying a month ago, well, tell us your arrival time. I was saying, well, I'll fly if the weather's good enough. If not, I'll take the train. So we finally resolved this morning that there was too great a cloud of likely icing between D.C. and the Princeton airport that my long-standing belief that the way to be a pilot over the years is to be very, very careful about the weather. So I took the Northeast Regional. I'm glad to be here with you now. I've been to that wonderful Princeton Airport, number 39 November, many times. How many of you have flown to that airport? Everybody should go out there, support your local airport, but in whatever way I get here, I'm glad to be here. Also, it's particularly touching for me to be here in the presence of Anne Marie Slaughter and Andy Mravchik, because we were neighbors for about a year in Shanghai, in the Tomorrow Square apartment building, when they were off the beat for Princeton and were doing the Lord's work in China, trying to understand it for their longer-term academic and governmental use. We had the joy of living in the same building and comparing all of our adventures in China. So it's nice to see them here. And so thank you for giving me the chance to talk about an issue that affects all of us in different ways. I'm abashed to have this large a crowd with this range of experiences in the media. And I think what I'm going to do is to talk somewhat schematically about a problem I'm trying to figure out myself. And in the 6 months or so since that article came out, I've done a lot of thinking about this issue. So I'm going to take you on a logical, what I hope will seem a logical and historical journey in thinking about the problem of the new media and how I was able to think about it as of earlier this year, when I had spent time at Gawker and at Google and a lot of other new media companies trying to observe what they did that was better and worse than the previous media model, and then where I at least have gone since that point. And what I find interesting now about solving the problems of media that we all confront. I'm going to do this in a way which is, I'm going to present this as a drama in 5 acts and then with a sequel. Now, Andy is a great world expert on opera, so I was trying to make some operatic connection, but I don't know enough to do that. I'll just say we're going to have 5 acts. And my watchword here is the only memorable commencement speech advice I ever heard, which was by the Miami humorist Dave Barry, who had lasting words, always particularly important in university settings and when you have an audience with a various range of experiences. He said that as we look at changing phenomena in the world, anything that happens before we personally are age 18 is the way things always were. Anything that happens between we are 18 and 45 is an exciting new opportunity. And anything that happens after we personally are 45 is a worrisome decline. So I'm trying very hard to work against that mental matrix. I don't need to tell you which category I'm in. And I'm going to suggest that many of the problems we're dealing now with the new media are the timeless problems of the media. And the solutions that have been worked out before, problems that have emerged before, are ones that present themselves in different guise, but in the same fundamental way, even in the age of Wikipedia and WikiLeaks and Twitter and everything else. They're ones that from the origins of mass media, people have been grappling with. So that's the basic, that's the intro. Let me now begin the 5-act construct of where we are and thinking about how we're going to inform ourselves and what I then derive as the action point. I'll try to spend only 4 or 5 minutes on each one of these so I can get to the payoff, and then we can have complaints, discussion, or whatever else. Act 1 is what I think of now as the pre-modern era. That is the world as I discovered it as of age 18, the way things had always been. Some people here in this audience remember when the media establishment was the way I'm going to describe. The rest of you, but even those of you who don't remember it, I think have it as a sort of imprinted memory of what things were once like in the role of mass media in the United States. And I think the journalistic historians who are here will identify this as the stage that went from roughly the end of the Civil War in the United States till probably the mid or late 1970s. That is when the United States moved from the previous highly partisan press that the United States had had in the fashion of Europe or Latin America in modern times to a more professionalized press with the pretense of objectivity, the goal of objectivity, of thinking there was some kind of more or less objective reality that could be presented. The elements of this world that we think of in retrospect, that as I was a university student, shifting from my original pre-med focus to getting involved in the college paper, thought were exciting about this world. First, there was a social air to it that was simultaneously respectable and raffish. What I mean is there was Walter Cronkite, there were Huntley and Brinkley, there was Edward R. Murrow, there was the CBS brand of broadcast news of people who had some sort of authority of saying, this is how things are, we are the dignified, mainly white male class who's going to go around the world and tell you in our very polished diction how things are. And that was the respectability that came with these journalistic establishments. As a side note, did anybody here happen to work for the great news magazine empires in, say, the 50s or 60s, where Time and Life and Newsweek had these worldwide bureaus where people lived like ambassadors, but with better entertaining budgets? You know, they would have these 5 martini lunches in Hong Kong and all the rest, and that was part of the respectable and raffish mode. Raffish in the sense that before World War II, journalism was largely a blue-collar activity. Even many of those respectable people I mentioned had come from non-college backgrounds. And you see both in older plays or older instruments of entertainment like The Front Page, or even in All the President's Men, the movie that's now almost 40 years old. You see in the juxtaposition of Woodward and Bernstein, the Yale guy and the non-college guy, and Ben Bradley, the Harvard guy, but not taking Harvard seriously. You saw sort of these combinations. And this social atmosphere was combined with a hold on public imagination that some of us here, or public information, some of us here remember and others can sort of imagine. I actually remember when I was in high school in Southern California in the 1960s, when the issue of Life magazine came out that entirely was devoted to all the Americans who had been killed in Vietnam in 1 week. And it was a large number, it was almost 100. So the entire issue of that magazine was the people who had died that week, or died in a week. And that had a tremendous leverage effect on public opinion, as did Walter Cronkite famously after the Tet Offensive in 1968. And you know many of the reasons why there was this kind of imposed centrality of opinion in the old model. There was the technological artificial bottleneck. There could only be 3 broadcast networks for spectrum reasons, and so you had to listen to those. There was the different commuting model. As East Coast cities shifted away from mass transit to cars, and as West Coast cities like where I grew up were mainly cars, there was not the afternoon commuter market to support afternoon papers, and they went away. There also was an important regional inefficiency that made newspapers broader in their reach than 30 years ago than they are now. When I was growing up in Southern California, my parents, who are both from the East Coast, but had gone out to California after World War II, they simply could not get the New York Times. If you got it, it came 4 or 5 days late by mail. And so the Los Angeles Times and even our own hometown paper had to broadly address an audience that was defined regionally but not by class. You know, that you had the LA Times aspired to talk to everybody in the greater Southland. It had this huge mass market. I could go on at some length about this old model, but we recognize the goods and the bads. And the goods and the bads, I think, are encapsulated both in the Vietnam story and the Watergate story, the 2 great stories that occurred in sort of the high moment of the old journalistic model. In the Vietnam story, for a very long time, the mass media were not skeptical of the claims of how things were going, but then when they turned, they were able to turn public opinion in a fairly dramatic way. Same too with Watergate, where most of the press was slow to get to it, but then they were able to have this great confrontation with the government. Civil rights coverage the same. We had the virtues of authority and we had the drawback of authority, where A.J. Liebling's famous line that freedom of press is guaranteed to anybody who owns one. It applied in those days, and there were all sorts of biases of kinds that I don't need to belabor now. So that's Act 1. The lost Eden, if you will, the previous era with strengths and weaknesses, but imprinting the model of what was once there. And Ted Koppel recently referred to this when he talked about gathering around the tribal electronic hearth, where people would listen to Cronkite or John Chancellor or the early Tom Brokaw, and everybody would know more or less the same thing. Something that really only happens now with major sports events. There's nothing else which has everybody else know the same thing. Act 2, which I'll talk about more briefly, since of course you can read the full version in my book from 15 years ago called Breaking the News, was what I think of as the false menace, the threat that emerged that actually prefigured a different kind of threat. And this was when some of the strains in the old model were beginning to show, and the mainstream media model was beginning to run into troubles that are sort of similar to the ones that beset it now, but had a different apparent cause at the time. And essentially, what I was arguing in this book, and many other journalism critics were arguing in the mid-1990s, was that the mainstream press was increasingly at odds with its legitimate and long-time political function. And when I say political function, what I mean is, pause for suspense, you can see what I'll say, that people in my business enjoy an immunity, a special constitutional status that people in most other businesses do not. And that's because of the idea that there were externalities to the role of a free press that were essential to the working of a democratic system. And so while journalism has always been a business, it has been, from its birth, a special kind of business, like education, which has to run on business principles but has other goals, like medicine, like law, like a few other things which are businesses but something more too. And I was arguing that a lot of the internal momentum and habits and sometimes laziness and sometimes vanity of the press we're taking it farther and farther away from its role of actually giving people the information they needed to make public decisions, and instead sort of indulging the internal interests of its practitioners. And I went at great length into things that now seem conventional, but I can tell you were controversial at the time. For example, observing how often TV and newspaper reporters would talk about the politics of an issue as opposed to the thing itself. And I had an example where I think when Reagan was attacking Libya back in the olden days, how instantly all the coverage was what this would do to his opinion polls, how this would affect the next day's race. And you all know of the ways that political reporters who are experts in politics, as opposed to experts in Libya, experts in the death penalty, experts in whatever, can convert everything to a sort of sports commentary style of coverage. There is the false equivalence problem, which many of you, I'm sure, have studied, which was beginning to be identified back 15 years ago. That is, it's one that was caricatured by saying there'd be a PBS NewsHour segment that would be introduced saying, and now for an alternative view, here's Adolf Hitler. The idea that for any issue, there are two sides, they have to be presented in equal ways, and that journalists in their objective mode have a very hard time saying, this is true, this is not true. These people are doing X, those people are doing Y, and they had such difficulty in trying to move beyond that. I was also talking about the way the infotainment bargain was beginning to evolve in malign ways within the news business. I mentioned earlier that news has always been a business because people have to be paid, and there are expenses, and it is expensive. And the difference is that there have always been some kinds of buffers which had kept news businesses from being pure profit maximization organizations. They would be family vanity, is the case of the Sulzbergers or the Pulitzers or the Hearsts or the Chandlers. There were things they wanted in addition to pure markets. There were regulations on most broadcast venues, et cetera, things which kept it from being just a profit maximization business. And as business pressure began to be exerted on our business, people realized, hey, the more entertaining we become, the more market we're going to get, because by definition, entertainment is interesting. The only thing that makes something entertainment is if it is interesting. And if the job of journalism is to present things that really matter in as interesting a fashion as you can do it, pure entertainment will still always be more interesting. That a movie star, a football game or whatever will finally be more interesting than even the most riveting presentation of events, just as we assume that education doesn't have to compete head-to-head with pure entertainment. There are things which can be good within their bracket, but still entertainment will always be more entertaining. And so journalism was going in that direction, and you saw the individual effect of it in many journalists who felt the way they could maximize their personal brand was through the talk show industry. And talk shows are now ubiquitous on TV, of course. Who knows the main reason talk shows are ubiquitous? They are cheap. Yes, they're the cheapest thing there is to produce. You just get people on there, you usually don't pay them, no crews, and so they're the easiest thing to produce, and they are profit maximized for the star, because then they can then leverage into other kinds of pay. And so to wrap up this second point, it looked as if the journalism business, by departing from what it should have been doing, which is trying to make the world as comprehensible as it can be, and giving people sort of the information they needed to live as citizens of the country, as the world, of their community, was going in a direction which was short-term economic beneficial for it, but in the long term, destructive for the country and probably for journalism as a whole, because in the end, if people have the choice of pure entertainment versus half entertainment, they'll choose the pure entertainment. And so they're kind of going into a death spiral. There's more I could say about that, but instead I'll move on to the third act, which is what I think of as the real crisis. The fact that over the last 10 years, essentially every economic fundamental of my business, and I assume the business of a number of you here, was devastated in a way that very few other industries have been in as profound a fashion in so short a time. There are ways that I could let's see, I have, through technological failure, this part of my presentation is not appearing on my iPad. So this is going to be sort of freelance improvisation. There were the technological bases of broadcast news were, of course, removed. When you went from 3 networks to a limitless number by the internet or by satellite, suddenly that enforced hold was taken away. There was the perfection of the communication across the nation had a beneficial and harmful effect on the previous business model. Here's something worth thinking about for a moment. Journalism, by definition, turns around the news cycle. You know, if you had forever to turn something out, you would be a scholar or whatever. But in fact, journalism is the best thing you can do by deadline time, whether that deadline is an hour from now or tomorrow morning or next week or next month. And suddenly, everything about the news cycle became transformed. Newspapers could no longer tell you what happened yesterday because you already knew, thanks to TV and radio. News weeklies could never tell you what happened the past week because you already knew, thanks to the improved newspapers. Monthly magazines like mine couldn't just do a better job than the news weeklies because the news weeklies were changing, et cetera, et cetera. So there was this forced reconsideration of everything that everyone had done. And what's worth thinking of for a moment is what happened to the newspaper business in particular, where within the space of 10 years, 3 blows, any one of which would probably have been fatal, all of which were visited on the newspaper business, and yet many of them are still around. One is the classified advertising business, which in many papers was 30% of their total revenue, is at most papers on a path to 0% of their total revenue, because online is simply a better way to deliver classifieds than is print. Second is the circulation of most newspapers is plummeting for reasons that you know. People have less time to read, they can get things online, the monetization model hasn't been worked out, et cetera. So circulation revenue is going down, and print display ads are going down too. The reason these matter, the big ads for banks or fashion houses or whatever, is that they paid, it was precisely because they were so unaccountable. The maxim in advertising, as you all know, is that half the money is wasted, nobody knows which half. The problem of accountable online advertising is you could tell which half people were clicking on, and the print ads that had been in their heyday from the Madman era before and onward suddenly were going away, and there'd been a huge premium then for newspapers. And so you had 3 different reductions of revenue for newspapers, which is why so many have closed, so many are in trouble, and we're going to have this complete reconsideration of the business model in ways I'll describe. An important point here. Many newspaper and journalistic and academic analyses of failing businesses emphasize the short-sightedness, the dinosaur-likeness, et cetera, of the managers who didn't see change coming. There certainly is a lot of that to go around in the news business, whether it's on the leadership side or the employee side or whatever. But I think the forces were bigger than even the most brilliant of the innovators. There's a very interesting story in the current issue of Columbia Journalism Review by Michael Shapiro about how the San Jose Mercury News, in the heart of the innovative economy, was not really able to cope with all of these. You know, the Confederate side had a lot of great generals, but they lost. And I think something is similar too with the newspaper business, that the forces were very big. More to say about that, but let me move to Act 4 so we can get to Act 5 and then the payoff, where I'm going to ask for your help. Act 4 is the glimmers of salvation appearing simultaneously on 2 horizons. Now, I know this is the realm of fact-based astronomy, so I won't say there's 2 horizons, but there are glimmers appearing in different corners of the journalistic universe. On the economic side and also on the content side, ways of thinking that something may be better than it might have seemed before. On the economic side, there are increasing indications that what we've been passing through in the last 5 years is not, as it might have seemed to many people, the first half of a drop from a 100-story building, and you still have the second half ahead of you. but instead perhaps nearing the bottom of a sine curve in economic ways, in business models, and understanding of the fundamentals, and in finding ways to match the market for news, the cost of providing news with the money that will be paid by people consuming news. I did a long article in The Atlantic about a year ago on just this topic, where I embedded myself with the people at Google who were at that time seen as the destroyers of the news business, and talked with them about what they would do if they were actually running news businesses, of try to find ways to monetize, as we say, the ever-increasing appetite for information around the world. And the short version of their answer, which I think is being applied in many other parts of the journalistic business now, is nobody knows the answer right now, because if they knew it, they would already apply it. But the process of trying 1,000 approaches, 2,000 approaches, 1,000,000 approaches, and seeing which ones work is well underway. I'm sure that everyone here has had a conversation on the theoretical possibility of paywalls for journalism. Will people ever pay for online journalism? Will they not? The Google people, to a person, told me, what an uninteresting question. Of course they're going to pay. It's just a matter of finding the way to do it. And if people already knew the way, it would seem natural, the way Easy Pass does on roads, or the way certain apps will on the iPad. And so an all-fronts effort to come up with these answers will come to a model that we don't know now, because if we did, we would already use it. I will say, as a side note, that The Atlantic magazine, which I'm proud to represent through all the 154 years of its history, after about 20 years of not making money, and quite seriously not making money about 10 years ago, was profitable last year and will be significantly profitable this year, because of ways we found to do a whole bunch of different businesses around our essential business of trying to understand the world and explain it in different ways. And the two aspects of this search for different business models that are actually continuous with the long history of journalism are, first, the fact that we're solving a problem that's been resolved many times in the past. The problem is there never has been a real market for real journalism. Real journalism has always been a parasite on some kind of other host. It's been a parasite on wealthy philanthropist owners, and there are some cases of those right now. It's been, in the modern era, it's been a parasite on the bundled model of newspapers. That is, you might buy the newspaper for the crossword, or for the travel section, or for the grocery store, or for the wedding announcement, or whatever, but you also got the foreign news. And that whole bundle is what paid for the correspondents who were in Baghdad or wherever else. The de-bundling of the internet was a terrible pressure on the bundled model of newspapers, but that bundle was itself an innovation 100 years earlier. And so this is solving the host parasite problem is not a new issue, it's an old issue. And it's one that people have come up with different solutions. The other long-time constant here is the fact that journalism has always been remade by people in their 20s. Almost anything you can think of that's interesting about a content innovation or a business model, somebody in his or her 20s came up with. Time magazine, which I'll just use as a classic example, was invented, of course, by Henry Luce and Britton Haddon a year out of Yale in the city of Cleveland, where they went to for cheap rent. And they thought there was a market for having news from around the country for people who didn't have great newspapers where they were. And that was a great business model in the 20s and 30s. It had its imitators. If you think of radio, if you think of TV, if you think of when I was a kid, of Rolling Stone being invented again, the fact that online business models and journalistic models are from people just out of college or graduate school, that's how it's been. And I think that's a good thing. And those of you, anybody here, any person fitting this demographic in the room, somebody in his or her 20s thinking of journalistic business models, or so good, go for it. History is on your side in terms of being able to make this work. The other, and so to shorten this, the lesson of the business of information, in my understanding, over the last 500 years, is that there's steadily been a larger demand for information and a larger effective demand too. People find ways of putting money behind their increasing appetite from a more and more educated society for more and more information. That will happen again, and people are figuring it out now. And even though I am in the over 45 bracket, I don't view this as a worrisome change, but as an exciting new opportunity. We then have the content front of whether we should think positively, or what are the positive things to think about the content innovations of this new era, as most traditional news organizations are under pressure, as new models are coming into being, and as they are more and more nakedly driven by a pure market model. I talked about Gawker as one of the centerpieces of my recent Atlantic article because they are the purest market model. There's a screen roughly this size in the Gawker newsroom where everybody can see it, and the every 5-second rankings of whose stories is getting the most traffic from where are up there. It's like a stock market ticker or an airport arrival board, and you are given bonuses or not, depending on how many new people you bring into the site with each story. And people know that. So that's the purest model. How should we think about this new era in terms of the information it would bring? I argued that there are lots of reasons to think that old problems of journalism will be better solved in this model. For example, the A.J. Liebling problem of freedom of the press applies to those who own a press. That's solved. Everybody can be his or her own publisher now. The problem of being able to give quick access to experts on certain sorts of fields. Some of you can remember the days when if you were an academic expert on Syria, academic expert on nuclear power or whatever, and something came into the news, you would write off to the op-ed page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and 4 or 5 days later you might see if you could get your views before an informed readership. Those op-ed pages still matter a lot, but now you can on your website. You can put out your expert views, and there's this informal reserve army of networking experts around the world in different subjects, even if that person is not heard again for 10 years. We recognize the risks of having bogus information get out there, and I'll come to that later on. But some of the old problems of access, of being able to bring things together in real time, of surmounting artificial barriers, those things have been solved. And I would argue that the kind of journalism that has often been most problematic in the past actually has been better practiced in the last 2 or 3 years than in past journalistic history ever. I would say, and Anne-Marie will certainly correct me if and when I am wrong here, that world understanding of developments in the Arab sphere was probably better this last year and a half than any other comparable foreign event in an alien culture by language and by time zone and by everything else that there is, because we were able to have some of the expert observers on scene. We had this impromptu army of experts who could weigh in. We had video from people during the massacres and during the protests and all the rest. Any of us who wants to be informed has a better chance to be fully and comprehensively informed than ever before. I could go on here about other things that are good with this model, but I will refer you, of course, to my article available free online at the Atlantic's site. We're tinkering with business models for the online site, and our app for the iPad, for which you pay, is really great. I just will mention that. So let me move now to Act 5 of this drama. And just as a reminder, the golden old days, the false threat, the real threat, the glimmers of hope, and now where we are as we think about the problems and the prospects of journalism and public information in this new media age. I would argue that compared with 3 or 4 years ago, we're beginning to see a kind of, the landscape is settling enough, even though it will be entirely active, that we can start seeing things that are going to work and things that are not going to work. The comparison might be the financial situation now with the financial situation in the fall of 2008. The fall of 2008, you had no idea whether the bottom would fall out of everything. There are certain serious risks right at this moment, as we all know, but it's not that same existential dread as I think many people had 3+ years ago financially. Something is similar in the news business, I think, where we can see some patterns emerging of strengths and weaknesses and what some of the specific dangers will be of this new model to see if we can shore up against those likely problems. Because I'm not at all trying to give a sort of Pollyannish, everything will be just fine message. I am trying to embrace change in general as the way journalism has and should always be and the way most of modern life has been, but I think we can see what some of the problems might likely be. First, we can see there is a obvious when you think about it, but we're thinking about risk of excessive institutional damage. I mentioned earlier the CJR piece by Michael Shapiro about how hard the San Jose Mercury News had tried. There's another good piece in that current issue by Dean Starkman, who's a reporter, who talks about the fact that institutions are hard to create and really do matter in terms of being the supportive institution, the supportive carapaces, or something more lively than that, for work that matters. If Princeton University were abolished tomorrow, something like it would be recreated, but there would be a lot of loss in the process. I say that even as a non-alum. It's the same is true with news organizations, that if the New York Times actually went out of business, if National Public Radio actually were broken in some way, if other institutions that still are around were allowed needlessly to collapse during this sine wave period, that would be bad, because it will take longer to build them back up than what we think. And so institutions that have lasted this long and have been through this crisis of the last 5 or 10 years, it's worth thinking about ways in which those institutions themselves can be nurtured through the next step. The New York Times is a particularly fascinating point here, because there has never been a news organization as influential worldwide as it now is, and it's never been in worse economic trouble than it is. Now, that will eventually be reconciled in the direction of success, in my view, but it's a process they have to go through. So institutional conservation during a time of upheaval is, I think, a specific goal to bear in mind. Second, we can identify certain specific missing pieces from the new media landscape that are going to be systematic market failures, and that are worth finding ways that I'll discuss later on to try to shore up. One of them is the boring sounding but important local accountability journalism. People reporting on police abuse or the zoning commission or city hall or anything that happens within the city of Princeton, the city of Trenton, the city of Los Angeles or whatever. The configuration of the new media landscape is making so-called hyper-local reporting of your own neighborhood more and more attractive, but not this kind of shoe leather reporting that requires costly investigation. That's something where there's a market failure. There's an interesting report recently by the FCC on this very point, what the missing parts will be of the new media landscape. A second allied one is likely to be that counterpart for state governments. We are victims, as in so many other things, of our own American history here. There's a reason that smart young people often don't go to state capitals to start their careers. That's because state capitals are often put in boring cities. It's in Springfield, not Chicago, Sacramento, not San Francisco, Harrisburg, not Philadelphia, et cetera. So the rustication bias of state capitals has made state capital reporting an area of failure. And the third likely market failure is not foreign coverage, it seems. We're able to have this informal army of people around the world pooling their efforts. But what is referred to in the business as public interest investigative reporting. That is the sort of things the muckrakers pioneered a century ago, and where you require unleashing somebody for a year or 2 years looking into the S&L situation or whatever. So it's not that journalism in toto is failing, but that there are identifiable areas where we can see there's going to be a market failure there, and it's not being really replicated by the new model, and so let's see what we can do about it. And more to say there, but let me move to the third area where we can see there's likely to be a problem, and this will be the transition to the inspiring coda, which is the general issue of public knowledge. That is, at a time when we have more information than ever before, and more ways to search it and parse it and rank it and assess it, people are arguably stupider than ever before. I say arguably because there is an argument. I did a piece about just when I moved back from China about a year and a half ago on the premise, is America finally going to hell? I asked people, a bunch of historical experts, and a number of them pointed out that America's always been going to hell, and Americans have never really known anything about anything. That they've been consistently uninformed about their own government, about the world, about science, et cetera. And so while we have these epiphenomena of public insanity at various times, we've had them for a long while, many of the historians say. Whether or not that's so, I would argue that it's more of an issue now because of its effect on self-government, because of its effect on science, of the connection of science to big issues. When I was a kid, in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of concern about whether the new science of the nuclear era and the vaccine era was going to be connected to public life, and there were worthy commissions about that. I think we're in a similar era now, where science of all sorts, whether it's in energy or in genomics or in the climate or whatever, these things matter around the world in each community, and the connection between them and how we think and talk and self-govern in many ways seems broken. So maybe not a problem of journalism, but a problem of public knowledge leads me seamlessly to my inspiring conclusion. Not Act 6, but the last part of this presentation before we have the discussion, which is that as people in journalism like me, and many of you in this room too, work on our specifically journalistic problems, I think we have some reason for hope. New businesses are being started. We know of all the small ones that are growing up. There are some big new ones that are growing up now too. Bloomberg and Reuters Thomson, between them, are basically hiring everybody who knows how to write in the modern world, and more power to them. They found a new parasite model. The Bloomberg model is parasite on Bloomberg business terminals, and Thomson Reuters is something similar with their financial network worldwide. So they're hiring journalists. That's fine. We're going to find ways to solve most of the journalistic problem. We'll try to deal on some of these market failure issues by identifying them and saying, what can we do to work on state house coverage? What can we do about what are new models for local coverage? A side note here, it's interesting. I'm sure you can correct me. I'm sure you will. I'm going to say it nonetheless. I believe it to be true that the 100th wealthiest U.S. university, whatever that would be now, one that would not even be that famous, has an endowment sufficient to run a major national newspaper into perpetuity. You know, the amount of money we're talking about is not that much compared to the money that goes to universities, that goes to museums, goes to other things. And so if there were a directed effort about public information and the kind of journalism that has a market failure, the money is there to solve it if we had the same kind of philanthropic effort. The larger, however, question is the public knowledge question. And that's the one that has begun to fascinate me. And the one that I'm now thinking of as the next thing I'd like to grapple with, of how not simply as an intellectual issue, but as an action issue, one could combine the resources of course, the journalistic world, which is in the business of trying to find out about things and has a comparative advantage in learning how to explain them to people, whether it's in broadcast or in print or in video or whatever else. The journalistic industry, the technology world, Google and its competitors, who are in the business of amassing the world's knowledge and indexing it and ranking it and distributing it. So that's journalistic institutions, technology companies, of course, universities, which are the tribunes and the trustees of human knowledge in its refined form over the millennia, and have a long-term stake in how people know what they think, and public policy institutions about how expert knowledge is brought to bear. Next of the component groups is some of the NGO groups, whether it's in their benefactor role, like foundations, or their advisor role, like unto McKinsey or other consulting firms. And finally, public organizations or institutions, whether we're talking about the FCC, which in the time of Newton Minow had a vision of what they would, how communications media should be involved in informing the public. That if there were some way to pool the efforts of journalistic institutions and technology companies and universities and the NGO world and, with care, state organizations, we could have some way of at least thinking about the question of public knowledge in all its various ramifications and what each of these organizations can do to try to have a public interaction worthier of the challenges we need to deal with. I was reading recently a book by our former Vice President Al Gore on this topic called The Assault on Reason. And he has one way of describing this with quoting Habermas and all these people, and it's a very impressive way of presenting the problem. I think it's probably not the way to get the problem down into every newsroom, every schoolroom, but that is, as I think of it now, the new media challenge, the governance challenge, the educational challenge of this time, of matching the information that we're going to be able to produce with different economic models, and that we're going to be able to have in a richer and more variegated way than ever before in mankind's history, with a public that is finding ways to silo itself off and become voodooized in various forms. This is a worthy challenge for any of us. And so I'm actually going to be thinking in practical terms of whether there's some institutional way to work with my friends in academia, my friends in all these different realms, to see what we can do to make a public that is better equipped to answer the questions that are proposed to it. So in conclusion, I say we've been through these 5 acts. From a journalistic establishment that had certain advantages we now miss and certain drawbacks we've managed to surmount, through economic and cultural changes which are putting us in a different, we've come to the other shore, and economically that shore is going to be sustainable, I say. It's sustainable enough, firm enough footing that we can think about the larger question of information for self-government and democracy, and that is what is interesting to me now. So that's my pitch. I'm happy to answer questions, complaints, or anything else of the sort. Thanks very much.
So we can open this up to questions and answers. There's 2 standing mics here. I'd ask that you keep it to a question rather than a speech. This is a mixed audience. Students, why don't you come down first and ask your questions, but certainly community members, once the students are done, you're welcome to join.
And while a student is coming down, I'll give my brief pitch. Being a journalist is the best thing you can do. Here's why. Here's a summary reason why. Number one, it's the most interesting thing you can do. You can have basically 25 people's lives in your own life. You can go out in a coal mine for a week, and then the next week they're still in the coal mine and you're not. And you can see lots of different things. So that's one reason. Second, it is, as I said before, an arena where people in their 20s can really change things. And so that's not the case in a lot of fields. If you like having to perform and being tested and not just sort of occupying a job, but having to create new things, it is exhilarating in that way. And finally, you can tell yourself that, as with some other fields, it matters. That the only way people know about the world that they haven't seen themselves is somebody telling them. And so if you give them a better view, so any person here of any vintage thinking of becoming a journalist, yes, you should.
So we'll open it to questions, and maybe while the students are coming down, because I know they're just thinking of their questions right now. I'll ask you a question. I sort of was with you on this idea of pooling resources and whatnot until you got to the public institution state part. And it seems to me that would be a radical departure from how we see media and our government. And I wondered if you could address that.
I think I was trying, probably not carefully enough, to suggest in carefully considered ways. And I guess my argument would be that especially in the realm of broadcasting the internet, the state has been deeply involved as a fostering and regulatory body. And I believe as much as anybody does here in the freedom from state interference of the press. I'm against this latest internet censorship bill that's going through the Congress yesterday and all that. So I think with care, we could recognize that under Newton-Minow, for example, the FCC did try to support a kind of public broadcasting that was better than if he hadn't done that. So careful, the old wrestling with a tiger, dancing with a tiger image, that it's something to consider in a careful way. And also, in many other democratic countries, the state has a much more pronounced role in information. In Australia and England and France, the state is actually more involved, so it would be a natural part. Yes.
Drew?
I'm very interested to hear more about how you envision this information sharing community that you described between higher education institutions, public affairs. It seems like these are places that can be silos to themselves, and that in kind of creating a conglomeration of them, you could have one big silo.
Yes, and so I'll confess that it is an admirable testament to the average acuity of a Princeton audience that the part of this I've thought about least is what you're putting is what you're identifying. So this is just what I have come to in the last couple of weeks and thinking about what to do about it. As it seemed to me that journalism is solving its own journalistic problems, that leaves another problem that journalism itself is not likely to solve, and that does require a bigger effort. And I guess I'm in the open to experimentation mode of thinking that there are a lot of other big issues where the involvement of different kinds of people we now take for granted. We take for granted that on questions of nuclear weaponry, for example, the scientific community in our nation will be involved with the government in ways that it needs to be careful about, but also they'll be involved with the other nuclear weapons powers, and the fact that they're connected is very important. And many other scientific communities have their bonds. In the East Coast pharma and genomics industry and the West Coast information technology industry, business-university interactions are, of course, deep, sometimes to a fault, and we take that for granted. I think that recognizing the danger you suggest, it should be at least aspirationally possible for somebody in one of these institutions to try to collaborate with some of the others. This is actually something I'm thinking of trying myself, just because I have feet in different parts of these worlds. It's another parallel point here is that, interestingly, journalism schools in particular, which don't exist here and don't exist in a number of other elite institutions, but do at Columbia and Berkeley and a few other places, have tried to turn themselves. They thought that the economic dark ages for journalism would make them into kind of a monastery community where they would keep a tradition alive while it was dying all around them. And then when things were going to respond. And so a lot of journalism schools have tried to be themselves practitioners of new ways of journalism. So recognizing the danger you suggest, I'm just beginning to think about how one could coordinate an effort among these different institutions.
Quick add-on.
Yeah.
Do you think you need to institutionalize channels for dissent?
Channels for dissent, in what sense?
So it seems like, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So it seems like there could be an economic model that emerges that everyone adheres to in that community, right?
Yeah.
There can be dissenting opinions that could be in the minority.
Yeah.
And that happens often in silos.
Yes, I think that as a general organizational and life problem, finding ways to empower and routinize and not squash in different ways dissent is an important one. So any model one would want to do that. I think that a good sign of the internet era is that, if anything, dissent is almost too empowered. The comment sections of blogs are often too empowered dissent. And they show a sort of Gresham's law of people not joining there. I don't have a comment section on my own blog. I quote reader mail out the wazoo, but the reason is, if you're not there to sort of monitor it 24/7, my judgment is it's dominated by its loudest element. So I quote readers all the time, but I don't have a free comment section. So finding ways to practically empower long-term dissent, yes, I agree.
Thanks.
And I'll enlist you in this effort.
Hi, thank you for
Everybody uses the mic correctly, more of us can hear the question.
thank you for speaking with us. My question is about science journalism, and specifically, I'm wondering on the issue of climate change, how much of a role do you think the non-scientific journalists have had in the misrepresentation of the issue? Just because often journalists try to tell two sides of a story and they try to balance things. And when there's an issue where the scientific consensus is a majority of people thinking that humans are contributing significantly to climate change, what role do you think science journalists specifically have in reporting on science issues versus journalists without that background?
Right, that's another good and hard question. I would put this in, so I read less of the purely scientific press than I do the general press, which includes science and other things. So I don't know whether, I would assume the purely scientific press does not treat this in a, on the one hand, on the other hand type fashion, right? I assume they say 98% of the people say this, 2% say that. We're going with the 98. Is that correct? In the science press?
In the science press?
Yes, in the purely scientific press.
I'm
So I will assert that until somebody tells me that I'm wrong, and have it as a premise for if we're talking about the general press, there are sequential challenges here for even the best intentioned journalists to deal with. One is the challenge of expertise. There are probably 15 or 20 issues where I personally feel authoritative enough to say this is right, that is wrong, but there are 10 times that many where I cannot say that. If I'm have to say something tomorrow about Morocco, I don't know anything about Morocco, and a lot of other things. And so since most journalists, and more as they're under time pressure and everything else, are dealing in areas where they are not themselves expert, the safest thing you can do is call people on both sides. And that's a structural reason why this happens. Now, that's not an excuse on big issues like climate change, because you should have experts there, and they should be able to say, look, we've looked into this long enough to say this is how it is, and this is a minority view, which we'll note, but we won't pretend is a corresponding view. So that is one problem. There is a second problem, which is the interaction of the sociology of the press and the money of the last generation in politics. It's an observed truth that most people in the media are liberals. This is just, people who say that's not true are crazy. And it is, it's not true of owners of publications, but it's just as more Southerners and Republicans go into the military than non, more people who are drawn to journalism are disproportionately liberal. They have become, over the last generation, gun-shy and Mao-able about being accused of liberal bias. And so if you have, the clearest example of this are the reports you'll read in the paper every day about dysfunction in the Senate. Nothing can get through, ignoring the fact that most of the filibusters in American history have been the last 5 years, and they've all been by one side. And so imagining this as sort of a symmetrical dysfunction is just showing sort of the gun shyness of being accused of being liberal. This shows up in climate change too, of people saying, well, you know, these liberals are talking about the media. So I think that it's a matter of having people be empowered enough in their own knowledge to be able to say, I'm not going to go beyond what I know, but what I know here is these people are the majority, these people are not. And recognizing an asymmetry in sort of where the pressure groups have been in the last generation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, you spoke a bit about the Arab Spring, and I was hoping you could elaborate a bit more. This past spring, I was in Egypt and Israel, and it was interesting watching Western coverage and seeing to what extent the role of new media and Facebook and Twitter was really emphasized. But I think there was a feeling over there that websites don't cause revolutions, people using websites do,
Right.
and calling it something like liberation technology maybe is overstating it. So do you think that there has been an overhyping of these media, and is there any drawback to that?
Sure. And so I'll answer this first indirectly. My wife and I were in Beijing for the first 3 months of this year during the Arab Spring. And what was so fascinating was watching it from there and how terrified the Chinese authorities were for no apparent reason that they'd have a similar breakup there. China has not been an economic failure, as you might have heard, and et cetera. But there was this huge clampdown within China because of fear of contagion from the Arab Spring, and social media were where the crackdown was first felt. Actually, the crackdown was first social media, second civil rights lawyers who were all arrested, and third the people they would have defended. So that was the sort of sequence of arrests. I think there is a distinction between two aspects of social media and the Arab Spring. One is the actual causation in times of social upheaval, and there are deep arguments that I'm not equipped to enter about which was the larger factor. If there'd been no Twitter, if there'd been no YouTube, how things would have played out differently, I don't really know. That military forces and police forces can, as the Chinese show and the Burmese show, they can matter more than social media at some points. That is a worthy argument to carry out in the months and years ahead. I know, again, Anne-Marie has written about this, was involved in it. The different point I was trying to make is that in the rest of the world's understanding of it, I think unarguably the whole panoply of communications meant we had a clearer and richer picture than would have been the case before. People on scene could send us real-time videos, sure with some potential for distortion, but also potential for focus on it. People who were blogging from there could get their views out. So in terms of the world's understanding, I think it was clearly a step forward. In what it meant for the internal dynamics, I don't know, and I'll be interested in following the argument.
Two quick questions. First, did you read the Redlands Daily Fax or did you read the Sun Telegram?
An Inland Empire guy.
I'm from San Bernardino, yes.
So I worked for the Redlands Daily Fax was my hometown newspaper. The San Bernardino Sun was the larger town paper. We got them both, plus the LA Times. And the hated San Bernardino Cardinals were our rival, of course. But it's okay.
I'm also a Sun alumnus. So the questions are, I work in social media here at the university. So the question I have is more about coming from journalism to social media where I am now. There's this question, the idea of journalism as gatekeeper, or newspapers as gatekeeper, and media as gatekeeper, when there's no one at the gate anymore. And what a lot of what we do in universities and corporations, I speak directly to the audience rather than necessarily assuming that someone in the media is going to exist who covers what I want to talk, the message that I want to get out, the news that I want to talk about, the event that's going on here today. And so I want someone who has a lot more experience at this than I do. Where are you with this idea?
The gatekeeper issue is one of a number that I shortchanged in my talk. It's a fascinating one where, in keeping with my general outlook, I am optimistic. That part of what we miss in the electronic hearth model is no longer Walter Cronkite being the gatekeeper for good and ill. He was the gatekeeper in certain good ways, but also there are things that couldn't get into if you didn't get noticed by the people in Manhattan, then you didn't exist. And that was the story of the civil rights movement for quite a while. So it's a different sort of gatekeeper function now. My observation is that on the whole, healthy new gatekeeper function is emerging. The Princeton alumnus, one-time Princeton trustee and Princeton donor Eric Schmidt, who's a friend of mine, has a sort of axiomatic optimistic view here. He said that people on the whole are going to be intelligent. So the more you can aggregate their views, the more you're going to have the right opinions finally prevail. And that's Google's entire model, of course. I am less Panglossian about that than he is, because you can see a lot of things that everybody believes that aren't true. Or takes a long time for error to be resolved. But I do think we can see even now the combination of some traditional gatekeepers, the New York Times, still very important, Jon Stewart, newly important, et cetera. Traditional gatekeepers, new gatekeepers in the form of Twitter, for example, which is very interesting in seeing what other people are talking about, blog links and blog roles. I think a on the whole, healthy gatekeeper system is reemerging, which also allows you to talk directly to people in a way that wouldn't have been possible if you just were emailing or faxing in your releases to the New York Times or the Trenton Times or whatever. So this part, I'm basically optimistic.
Thank you.
I know you.
Just to add on that last point, I think particularly on Twitter, what's emerging are curators who are gatekeeping in a different way. So Jim, it's wonderful to welcome you to Princeton. I do note that you're wearing a crimson tie. You just couldn't quite resist bringing in your Harvard affiliations, but we're thrilled to have you.
It's even more embarrassing than this. I've gotten to the point where I only have about 2 neckties. So this is the one I had, and I was too late for the training to go to the necktie store there.
Duly noted. I just thought you were wearing rival colors. This is a comment as much of a question, but I love where you ended, the idea of bringing together multiple different nodes of a public knowledge network is one way to think about it. But that you still have the problem of getting that knowledge into the ears of people who don't want to hear it and can now opt out. And one thing I wondered is whether there might be a new kind of bundling model, right, where you deliver them things you know they want because you can track where they're going now, but that's where you put, climate change is real on the side or whatever the evidence is. But it occurred to me as you were saying, real journalism has always been a parasite, that if you flip that might be very valuable for the public knowledge dissemination model.
Yes, thank you. That is a very good idea. And as a segue to one other thing, I mentioned earlier that brand and display advertising was going away precisely because it wasn't accountable and trackable ads are so accountable. It's a per-click model, et cetera. Display advertising and brand advertising is starting to come back because still you have to give people a way of knowing about things they don't know they're looking for. And so if you go to the Atlantic site, for example, you are deluged with, thank God, all these display ads we have for companies and political causes or whatever. But I agree, there will be some new bundling model, I hope, and finding ways to bring it in is part of our ongoing challenge. So thanks. Yes.
You mentioned your blog, which I follow actually on my Google Reader, and I see how frequently you update it. And so it seems to me that you're operating in several different registers, that you have this blog that you update pretty regularly, you're writing long articles for The Atlantic, you're also writing books. And I know, for example, The New Yorker requires its correspondents to have blogs on their site as well. And so I'm wondering, I can see the appeal of this, having kind of an instant, getting your message out right away, and then also having the opportunity to write long. But at the same time, do you think that journalists are having their attention diverted a little bit too much with the obligation to blog, to tweet, to write long articles?
Yeah. That's a real question. And as for the toll this places on the writer, I'm actually only 32 years old. That's what it's done to me.
I'm writing a dissertation and I blog at the same time, so I see this in my own life as well.
Yes, and I think that blessedly at The Atlantic, I never have to do a blog, but I think when there's something that is sort of in my wheelhouse, for example, a presidential debate, there's an expectation that I will do something about it, but I never have to do it. And my own mental model is I never have to do it. And so the standard for me is always, can I do this quickly? And is it something that is not right for an article or a book? For example, in the last 3 or 4 days, I've been getting people writing to me from around the world about whether Mormonism is a dangerous cult or not. And it's really interesting to have all these things. So I just sort of plaster out these reader messages. So I have found it, I first started doing things online for The Atlantic in 1994. We had the first online site of a major magazine. And so I found it a valuable way to connect with a diaspora of people and explore things that I don't get to write about, like beer, for example, or flying airplanes, or boiled frogs, or whatever. And so, but I do recognize it as a danger, and I just finished a book about China, and I went for like a 3-month blogging hiatus and had guest bloggers. So it's one of the many management issues we all face, like managing how much food you eat and things like that. It's that kind of management issue, I think. But you're wise to recognize it at this stage of life.
Okay, so we really need to wrap up in about 10 minutes. So these are, it looks like we have 4 questions left, and then I'm going
And I
to,
will be more concise.
and I'm going to call it at that, so.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you only have 2 ties, which suggests that raffishness has not disappeared, despite your dapper appearance. An aspect of gatekeeping that I've been very concerned about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is authority. And certainly one of the things about Walter Cronkite, everyone said they trusted him. So where we don't trust institutions anymore, how do we create trust in the new media? Thank you.
That's another real problem. And I could leave it at that. Or I could say that there has been, again, an evolution of socially based trust. I am negligent in not having a blog role on my own site because I actually view that as an important element of trust building. And there's a very interesting paper by a guy named Mark Bernstein a couple months ago about how important it is to have blog roles to keep links alive and to have sort of expanding networks of contacts. So I think that as there has been, as previously erected and artificially protected pillars of authority have eroded, we're not going to recreate the same thing, but I think we'll recreate something, and you already see it. Again, there are curators, as Anne-Marie is saying. There are people who, if they say this is important, I pay attention to it. And there are more of them than there were 15 years ago, and on the whole, that's better. It has drawbacks, but I'd say on the whole, it's better. And I think there is enough of a human desire for some kind of clarity that will move past the current dark ages of public knowledge to some lighter age of public knowledge, I hope.
Hi. What's it like to have the readers talk back to you? Like nowadays, they have comment sections at the bottom of the stories.
Yeah.
Even in major journals, a lot of the AP stories on Yahoo and stuff. And I mean, at this point, I mean, if I already know the story, I'll just go see the comments.
Yeah.
It must be. I did daily journalism a long time ago, and I would have gone. I mean, next morning, I just would have clicked to see what people are saying about me.
Well, it's in my pre-internet stage of journalism, I would always get lots of letters from readers, and I would answer them because people are giving you the ultimate respect by reading what you say, and so I feel as if there's some kind of engagement. And the Atlantic's audience has always been good and serious and disproportionately letter writing, usually in a good way, with a few crank exceptions. And in the Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a great blogger for The Atlantic, has a wonderful comment site, but he spends 3 or 4 hours a day managing that. Because as soon as somebody says something troll-like or obscene or getting into Nazism or whatever, he kicks them right out. And because he does that, it's a great comment site. If he didn't do that, in my experience, it becomes just this sewer. So because days may go by when I'm not on the internet, I don't have an open comment site, but I do publish a lot of stuff from readers, complimentary or not. For example, I just put up something on the train coming up here from a guy who was irate in that if I was defending Mormons, didn't that mean I was oppressing every gay person on earth and wishing they had AIDS? And I was thinking, well, actually not, but I gave this guy his say. So I find it a worthwhile way to be engaged, and often people just want to be listened to, and it's an interesting array. So
We get the feeling that that's who's out there and no one else.
well, if I were judging just by the Atlantic's readers, I'd actually have a pretty good view of humanity. It's a really interesting group of people around the world that I'm really glad to have heard from. There's a guy in New Zealand who writes in all the time, and people in Chengdu, and people in Burma, and so it has given me. I'm sounding more optimistic in this last hour than I usually am, but this has been relatively uplifting for me about a life. Now, being in politics, that was different. Yes.
Hello, I'm an aspiring journalist, so thank you for reassuring me that there's still hope in this industry, unlike my parents.
Yes, you should go for it.
But one of the questions I have is about the unbundling that you talked about as an advantage. Do you think that's a disadvantage in terms of public knowledge? Because people can consume what they choose to think is important. So on Twitter, for example, you have things like Kim Kardashian's marriage ending up as more important than things like Egypt's elections.
Yes. And so the siloization and the privatization of different information spheres now is a real problem. And it was the case when I was a kid, and I got the LA Times and the San Bernardino Sun and the Redlands Facts. They would tell you, here are the 5 stories that matter on the front page, and you had to at least look at them. And the Evening News said, here are the 5 things that matter too, even though the stories were very short. So it is one of the problems to deal with. I would assert, though, that it's almost never the case that I go on the internet and I look at only stuff I was intending to look at when I started out. You know, there's usually 20 different click jumps I take, and things I had no idea I was going to be looking at, I end up doing 20 minutes later. And so that's a different kind of serendipity than what the authority of newspapers offered, but it does offer some avenues, you know, trying to have people have reminders that this matters. And significantly, Google News, which is mainly algorithm-driven, saying here's what the main papers around the world are publicizing, also has an editorial function of saying, here are 5 things we think are important, and we're going to put on our front page no matter what else is happening. So I think there remains a judgment curatorial role to offset pure Kardashianism. But there's been Kardashianism before Kardashian. You know, Jane Mansfield was a big deal when I was a kid, and the murder of, who was the murder trial with Mickey Stompanato or some, there was some, Lana Turner. This was the headline of the LA Times for my entire youth. So it's been this way before too. So we have to keep struggling. Thanks, yes.
How did The Atlantic become profitable?
Thank you for asking. We just got back from a 2-day executive retreat discussing this very issue. A combination of 3, the core business, as we call it, the legacy business of the actual magazine. We have had tightening in the cost area and the best ad sales team we've ever had. And our audience is distinguished by being the best educated audience for any publication that exists and the second wealthiest audience for any publication that exists. I won't tell you who the first one is. It's not who you would think. It's a magazine you probably don't even know of. So we're able to sell brand advertisements for corporations, for luxury goods or whatever. And so we're able to say this is a readership now of circulation 500,000, readership 5 million. These are people you want to reach. So the magazine is doing well with print advertising. Our website has been a gigantic business, and I would argue editorial success. It's now, I think, at about, it doubled in unique visitors last year, and it doubled the year before that, and is quite a presence, and has a lot of advertising revenue. And then we have the events business, which is Aspen Ideas Festival, Washington Ideas Forum, the Atlantic Meets the Pacific. And in an era of connectivity, face-to-face connection is actually an increasingly luxury item. And people will pay a lot of money to be at events where there are famous people speaking. This is the Davos model of success. I'm not necessarily endorsing this as a crown of human achievement, but I'm saying that it's a business model that has been very good for the Atlantic to have events we sponsor where our editors interview famous people and people pay to come. So that's the 3-legged stool of the Atlantic's profitability. But subscriptions are where it all starts. So I leave you with that word, subscribe.